Streaming bandwidth provided by Worship Channels. Visit them online at worshipchannels.com. Live streaming made simple. Today's podcast is brought to you in part by Podcasting Church, my first book, all about podcasting in your local church. Get your copy for free by going to bit.ly/podcastchurchfree. Go ahead and do it today. On today's Tech Help for Churches, making an audio podcast. Welcome everyone to another episode of Tech Help for Churches. My name is Paul Allen Clifford and I am your host. So let's, right off the bat, let me ask you to do just a couple of things. If you have any questions or comments, this show is recorded 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific on churchtechcast.com, so you can go over to the chat if it's one of those times and feel free to ask any questions that you have. I've got the chat window open to my left, your right. And I am keeping an eye on it for questions. You might see, if you're watching the video, that I have my email address on, paul@trinitydigitalmedia.com. You can head over to trinitydigitalmedia.com and comment on this blog post if you'd like, or give me a call, 1-877-763-3246, and I would be happy to interact with you there. That's 1-877-POD-ECHO, by the way, if you want to think of another way to remember it. So, without further ado, let's get into our topic today. Podcasting. Now, there has been a lot of talk as of late. I think Time Magazine and also USA Today have said, podcasting is back! But the people at Wizard Media, the owners of Libsyn, which is, from what I hear, the largest podcast host, say, it never left. Our numbers have been steadily increasing since 2005. So it's not that it's back, it's that people are starting to notice it again. There was some initial buzz and people kept listening to podcasts, and then the people that were really easily excited dropped off, but new people that weren't as about it joined in, and it's been growing ever since. But it occurs to me that your church may not be on the podcast bandwagon yet. Now, I've talked in previous episodes about things like podcasting different things other than the Sunday sermon, but I haven't talked about the technical stuff of podcasting. So you might believe that you record an audio file, you throw it up on your website, and you're done. That's a podcast. Not exactly. That would be a downloadable audio file. Now, you can also have a downloadable audio file with your podcast, but that's not a podcast. A podcast is an audio feed that is automatically downloaded to either a smartphone or a computer or something like that using a mechanism called RSS. So basically, we've got three things to deal with an audio podcast. We've got the audio file, we've got the feed, and we've got media hosting. So basically, that is the file itself, the mechanism for getting the file automatically delivered to your device, and where it comes from. So let's talk about each of those three in turn. First, the audio file. You might think, well, I'll just use a FLAC or an OGG Vorbis or maybe a WAV or an AIFF file. I'd really strongly recommend against that. There are two formats that have caught on for audio files in the case of podcasts. and those are MP3 and um, and the Apple version, the enhanced podcast. Now, the latter only plays on Apple devices. So, really, when I say caught on, the only one that's really caught on is the MP3. So, that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, you might be familiar with MP3s as audio files, like for songs that you download or something like that. But there's no reason that an MP3 can't be a spoken word file. So if you're listening to the audio of this, you're hearing an MP3. Now, the clear advantage of the MP3 is that it is small. So you can put hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of music in MP3 format on an audio CD. The disadvantage is it's very compressed. So the first thing that an MP3 tends to do is strip off the high end, the stuff that's towards the high end of what you're hearing, and strip off the low end. Now, if it strips off the stuff that's outside your hearing range, you can't hear that at all, so you probably don't need that, especially for spoken word. For music, some of the lower end stuff you can actually feel more than you can hear, and for classical music especially, that might be a problem. So it strips off those, it compresses it depending on how you do it, and I'm just going to touch broadly over this. If you want more details, I've put more details into my first book, Podcasting Church, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, is free if you go to http://bit.ly/podcastchurchfree. Now, you'll have to sign up for my newsletter, but feel free to unsubscribe if you don't want to be a part of it. But if you do, I send out stuff every week. Sometimes it's helpful hints, sometimes it's things I'm learning, etc. And sometimes it's free stuff. So you don't know, but it is something that I do send out on a weekly basis. So that is kind of the bare minimum, because not all MP3s are made alike, by the way. You can have an MP3 that is not as compressed, so it's a pretty good sized file. It's still much smaller than a WAV or an AIFF file, which are uncompressed audio files. But you can have a pretty high res, if you want to think of it that way. Think of it like high definition television versus standard definition. You can still make out the video of standard definition, it's just not as pretty. And for some stuff, you really don't need as pretty. So if you're trying to save money on sending files, if you're also thinking about the listener and how much space they have on their iPhone, on their Android device, on their MP3 player, on their computer even, then you might want a smaller file. Now, since podcasts tend to be, they don't have to be, they tend to be spoken word, a lot of people will mix it down to mono as opposed to stereo. And that has the advantage that if you're listening to it with one earbud, or like my old car, I drive a 95 Camaro, and some of the speakers from listening to a little too much heavy metal are a little blown. So I really have one really good speaker, and that's driver's side rear. So that's the one that I tend to use the most. Well, if it's a stereo file and the audio is panned one way and then the other, sometimes I'll hear just a distant talking. Sometimes interview shows can be particularly annoying because I'll hear on one side one person talking very strongly, and then I'll hear the other person talking very distantly. So it's actually better to mix it down to mono in that case. When I'm running, I listen with two earbuds, and um, that would be less of an issue. Although it might be a little annoying to me as I'm running along to hear someone talking in this ear, then someone's talking in this ear. And if you're listening to the audio, I was indicating my right ear, then my left ear. So that's a little bit annoying as you're kind of by yourself. So mono is actually preferred for spoken word, just talk radio kind of podcasts like this one, because that way people don't get annoyed by the sound separation, and it's not as difficult when you have substandard audio systems that you're listening to it on. You can get mixed down to like 48 kilohertz, and when you're talking about spoken word, there's not as much information there, so you can get a pretty small file. So, for example, this file that you're listening to, I'll probably mix it down pretty small, and it'll probably be 10 megs or less, which, of course, back in the day was very huge, but nowadays is pretty small. So you'll be able to get that downloaded, throw it into your iPhone, Android device, MP3 player, computer, what have you. And the way that you download it, you could go to my website every week. I tend to release these on Mondays. So you could go every Monday and download Tech Help for Churches. But I would suggest that there is a better way to do it. And this is what makes a podcast, and that is syndication. So imagine, we all remember paper newspapers. There are still some of those around. I used to be a paper boy, and when I was delivering them, I didn't think that my children would really not have the opportunity to deliver newspapers because so few people get them. So imagine the difference between you wake up on Sunday morning and there is a newspaper on your front step, or you wake up Sunday morning and you think, I'm curious what's in the newspaper. I think I'm going to hop in the car, go down to the local Quickie Mart, and pick up a newspaper from a poo. That's a Simpsons reference, by the way, if you didn't get that. So, see how there's much more difficulty involved? Something that people don't always get is podcasts tend to be free. So they're either advertising supported or they're just a hobby where someone wants to get their information out. They want to get their voice out, and so they do it for free. So since these things tend to be free, the subscription is free. Now we think of subscription as costing money, but it's free. Now the mechanism is called RSS. Now RSS stands for either, depending on who you ask, Rich Site Survey or Really Simple Syndication. And I, quite frankly, don't know which it stands for, but I've heard both. And I've heard both from authoritative sources, so I'll just mention it both ways. Now, an RSS feed looks a lot like gobbledygook, although if you really dive into it, you can see that it's got several parts. I've got an entire RSS feed in my book that you can look at. But there's kind of a part of the RSS feed that says, okay, this is the show. RSS is coded with a language called XML, which is Extendable Markup Language. And what that means is, while it wasn't originally intended to do radio type shows or television type shows, it was extended to include that. So it's got like, this is the show name, and then you put the show name. This is the host, and then you put the host. This is a contact email address, and then you put the contact email. So it's not difficult to create one by hand, but you don't have to. A lot of websites, Squarespace websites, um, the Google um, site creator apps type websites, and especially WordPress, which is what I highly, highly recommend, create this for you. So, what I do is I have a WordPress site. WordPress is basically software that runs on a server somewhere, and I rent space on a server, and I upload my file to a media host, and then I put the link in the back end of WordPress on a post, and it says, okay, I'll generate the correct RSS feed, and I'm done. So it's actually fairly simple to do once you uh, know how to do it. And I might make a screencast sometime to talk about just how you would do such a thing. So you've got your audio file, which needs to be an MP3. You've got your RSS feed, which would be generated by your website, or you can write it by hand, or there's software you can download to make it. Any of those are permissible. By the way, the RSS feed has to be hosted online somewhere, but it's a very small file, like measured in kilobytes. It's itty bitty. And as my 12-year-old daughter said, well, what's a kilobyte? Well, a kilobyte is 8 bytes, or 1,000 bytes. What's a byte? 8 bits. What's a bit? It's the smallest piece of information a computer can process. So it's a really small file. If you had 1,001 kilobyte files, you would still only have about a megabyte of information. It's very, very small. So these RSS feeds are measured in kilobytes. I like to think of an RSS feed as a shopping list. Your computer, when you subscribe to a podcast, usually through iTunes, although there are other methods, holds on to the most recent shopping list it has. And then from time to time, it compares its shopping list to what's on the server. And if there's a newer version of the shopping list, it gets the newer version of the shopping list. Then it compares what's on the shopping list to what it has. And if there's anything new, it goes out and it gets it. I really wish this was literally a shopping list, because I would love to do my grocery shopping that way. Just have a list and stuff shows up at my house, and I don't have to worry about being out of milk because my refrigerator tells it, and someday in the future I'm sure that's the way it'll be. So, all that to say, you've got your audio file. You've got your RSS feed. Where does the audio file live? And how do you get that to people? That's our next question. I had an episode of Tech Help for Churches a couple months back. You might look back where I talk about media hosting. But let me tell you what I use and why I use it. I have an account with Libsyn.com, and I've got a few other accounts with different hosts, but Libsyn is by far my favorite. They're also the one that I pay for. There are other free accounts that I've been messing around with, and I'll talk about those next week on Tech Help for Churches. So basically, for around $5 a month for an audio podcast released once a week, that's 15 minutes or something like that, compressed properly, about $5 a month. So not a lot of money. $60 a year if you want to think of how little money we're talking here. You can upload a file to a Libsyn account, Libsyn, as in Nancy.com. Upload it to that account, and then use that link anywhere you want. And whether one person downloads it, and that's you just to check your audio quality, or 1 million people download it, you still pay $5 a month. Now you can only upload so much, and that's why it's the $5. If you need to upload more per month, because they've noticed that after the first month the downloads fall down, so they just give you the archiving of it for free. So if you um, upload more stuff, then there are $20 amount a month accounts and so on. But I use the very basic $5 a month account at libsyn.com. And the reason that I do that is, first and foremost, they understand podcasting. So they don't do things that kind of mess you over. Secondly, the reason that I do that is, while my web host claims to be unlimited bandwidth, unlimited storage, I have heard horror stories, tons of them, not just one, but tons of them, from people that said, well, it says unlimited, and so they put their media, like their podcast MP3, on their web host, and before you know it, the company notices this and says, oh, when we said unlimited, what we meant was an unlimited website, not any unlimited media that's attached to the website. Silly person. And then they get mad at you and either charge you more money or suspend your account. Suspending your account is actually better in this case, which I hate to say, but that's the way that it is. So I would absolutely look into a media hosting account. They have them at Libsyn, Blueberry. There are others, but those two are my favorites. And by the way, Blueberry is BLUBRRY.com. What I would look for is, I would look for a host that gives you a direct download to the MP3. That really matters. There are some other hosts, and I'll talk about them next week, that do not give you a direct download to the MP3. And they all provide you with an RSS feed. I do not advise that you use an RSS feed from any service. I advise that you use your own RSS feed, because if you use your own RSS feed, you can always put it on another server somewhere else, and you have not lost your audience. Imagine this situation. You have an RSS feed that 10,000 people are subscribed to. It's pretty big, but it could happen. And all of a sudden, you get in a billing dispute with your media host or with whoever. Or they go out of business, or they get bought by somebody, or there's a million things that could go wrong. So you get in a situation where you need to move. Well, you move your media because you got a backup copy somewhere, but they're not willing to move your RSS feed. So 1 week you've got 10,000 listeners. The next week you have zero listeners. Now you can put in a request in iTunes to say, hey, can you move my people over? But it's more difficult than if you had control of your RSS feed. Think of your RSS feed as the frequency, the channel that people tune into. And if you've got that, it doesn't matter where the media that's pointed to by that frequency, that list, lives. It matters that you have control of the list. So those are your three basic things that you need for an audio podcast. Now, that's very, very basic. You'll notice I have intro music. Notice I have outro music. You'll notice I've got podcast art. You'll notice that I have kind of a format that I follow week in and week out. Those are all more advanced things that we can talk about on a future episode. But until then, I want you to investigate podcasting, because mainstream media is starting to notice it again. And they're starting to think, well, maybe this is a good way to deliver media. But those of us who've been doing it for years and years, And while I've only been doing tech help for churches for 4 months or so, I've done Technobabble, my other podcast, which you can see over at trinitydigitalmedia.com. I've done that on and off since 2005. So there are just tons of opportunities in this space. And I've seen nothing but more and more people getting involved. And think of it this way, your smartphone is now a radio receiver, if you want to think of it like that. It uses the internet, it doesn't use radio waves. But you can get shows about anything that you can imagine, anything that you would want to listen to information about on this device, and you can listen to it whenever, wherever you want. It's not limited by the FCC, it's not limited geographically, it's not limited by budget, because you can do it very inexpensively. And so the information can get out. Now think about this for the gospel, because this is tech help for churches. Think about the opportunity that we have, because the Chinese government cannot swat millions of podcasters. It just can't filter that well, because what they do is they filter each and every individual one. So that is one thing that they will fit, that podcasting can fix, is like a swarm of mosquitoes with good news. We can get into the Great Firewall of China. We can get into Iran, like a swarm of people talking about the real Jesus, who really loves people and isn't just a sub-prophet, not quite as good as Muhammad. We can do amazing things. And so that's what I want you to think about. Think about all the ways that we can go out and change eternity. Until next time, I'm Paul Allen Clifford with TrinityDigitalMedia.com.